Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go right ahead, Mark.
Great. Um, well, it's a pleasure to be here today to talk to you about invasive plants. And hopefully your woods do not look like this picture. This is all too common of an aspect, and we've been doing some increasing work on managing invasive shrubs and invasive trees. And I'm just going to share with you some of our results and some information. Bill wanted me to give one talk, and I said, there's no way we can cover it all in one talk. So he was gracious enough to split it up into 2 days. So today we're really going to focus on some general information about these woody invasives. And then tomorrow we're really going to get into the nuts and bolts of how we control it, what the tricks of the trades are. If you want to use herbicides, which mixtures work best, how do you want to apply them, things like that. So I encourage you to put your questions in the chat box. If we have time, we'll get through it today. If not, we'll definitely address it on Thursday. So just a little bit about me. I've been a professor and extension specialist at Madison for over 15 years. And I cover many topics, but one of the main areas I focus on is invasive plant biology, looking at its spread, its impacts, and how to control these populations and restore back to a desirable plant community. And while we publish papers, the ultimate goal of mine is to get this information into the hands of people like you so you can use it on the landscape. So you'll see we have an active dissemination and lots of resources that I'm going to point out through today. So what's the goal for today? I'm going to really highlight the impacts woody invasive plants are having in our forests. A lot of times we think of some of the impacts, but we don't realize how widespread those impacts are. I'll briefly introduce some common ones, and I think on Thursday we'll talk some more about some of the others. And then I'll talk a little bit about how to develop a plan for managing these, some considerations. And Thursday, we're really going to get into the weeds, so to speak, on how you manage it, which options do you want to choose, and what the pluses and minuses are. But I'm going to talk about some of those, but really and not in incredible detail. But if I have time for questions, we can do it then. So first off, I thought I'd show you some pictures. This is a great example. I took it in Door County of a not invaded forest that is healthy and productive. Here's a heavily invaded forest in southwestern Wisconsin. This is Japanese barberry invading there, and you can see some of the impacts there. Again, another non-invaded forest. This is at the UW-Madison Arboretum. And then in southern Wisconsin, this is a picture of a heavily invaded forest. You can't even hardly see the trees because of all the bush honeysuckle. And yes, that is garlic mustard underneath the bush honeysuckle. So these pictures are really different, right? So I know it's not that interactive, but there's clearly, we can visually see some big differences between invaded and not invaded forests. And I think as humans, we look at the visual differences first. So it's very clear that the non-invaded forests are more open, there's more diverse vegetation, and we really focus on the vegetation. Well, what I'm going to try and talk to you about today is all the other impacts that these invasive shrubs are having on our systems that we can't see, that isn't as evident. And hopefully this will make it more compelling of you to manage these populations. So clearly, when we look at this picture, we can see we have trees and we have Japanese barberry, and there's not really much of anything else there. We're really affecting the native vegetation, particularly in the understory, and the regeneration potential. I think that's an easy sell. What's a harder sell is we have impacts to wildlife, impacts to the environment, and impacts to us as humans. And a lot of times those aren't visually aware of, but these are arguably probably equally, if not more important than some of the vegetative impacts. So I'm just going to go over some of these to really emphasize how bad these invasive woody plants are to our forests and woodlands. It's been documented that we can get impacts to water and soil from having heavily infested areas. We get infested areas, we'll see increased runoff, resulting in increased soil erosion, channelization of streams and rivers that are going through our properties, and a lot of higher use of water. Probably even more concerning, some of the new information coming out is that a lot of these, like buckthorn, can change the soil nutrient dynamics of the forest. Buckthorn leaves have higher nitrogen than carbon ratios, so that changes the degradation and the leaf litter decomposition rates, and a whole slew of other soil properties that we believe affects regeneration and a bunch of other processes. We're also believe that we're seeing changes in the microbial populations, again, changing what the trajectory of those forests and woodlands are. A lot of people say, yeah, but I love these invasives because I see the birds eating their berries. Yes, the birds do eat their berries, but research has come out showing that the fruit is not a good food source for those birds. They actually are lower in fat content and energy density than our native berries. And so birds have to eat more of them to get the same amount of energy. Plus, many of them are a diuretic, and you'll see this particularly with common buckthorn. And so basically it just goes right through them, and they really don't absorb much of the nutrients at all. And then it really benefits seed dispersal and establishment because you're getting all those nutrients put it right where that seed lands so it can establish well. There's been a growing body of evidence as well that the structure of many of these shrubs increases predation of native wildlife that is growing, that is in our forests. Definitely in shrublands, we're seeing huge shrubs. In grasslands, we're seeing huge impacts. Some new research has come out that show the structure of the shrubs in the understories of the forest is impacting many of our mammal populations there too, not providing as much cover and resulting in large changes in those populations. Some work has been done on the bush honeysuckles showing that some of those can heavily impact even our aquatic systems that run through our forests and have large effects on food web dynamics, but particularly the invertebrates that things like our trout feed on are dramatically changed when streams are lined with bush honeysuckle. So again, we're impacting fish as well. And a lot of people don't really think about the economics, but I think this is a really, particularly in Wisconsin, is something we need to think about more. These populations, when dense, are incredibly expensive to control. I'll show you some data, but easily over $1,000 per acre per treatment. If you're interested in harvesting some of your wood for timber, it's been documented that these dense infestations will delay forest regeneration by 15 to 30%. So imagine if you have to wait 15 to 30% longer to get that paycheck, that could be pretty annoying, or pay these really large costs to manage these invasives. And in grasslands, we can get reductions in forage as well. And then finally, we don't think about this, but these can really impact human health and recreation when we have these invasives there. Several of these species have been shown to have positive associations with ticks that can increase the incidence of human pathogens like Lyme disease and alpha gall syndrome. Research in New England has clearly shown this, and we've substantiated it here in Wisconsin, that we have these large populations of Japanese barberry, like you see there. We have higher populations of ticks, and the ticks are a higher proportion of them carry Lyme disease. So bad news for us. This alpha gall syndrome is a weird disease that if you conduct it, it causes you to be allergic to red meat, among other things. And so if you like red meat, clearly do not want to get this disease as well. And we are starting to see this lone star tick in Wisconsin, although it's debatable whether it can overwinter. It's being hitchhiked along by some bird populations, we believe. And then these shrubs are just not pleasant to be around. You get poked and prodded all the time by these. They have a lot of appendages that can be nasty to work around as well. Well, what we don't know, and hopefully our lab is just starting on some of this work, is when some of these impacts start to become, on how dense some of these infestations need to get. But clearly, the problem gets worse as these populations get more developed. So I just want to briefly go over this invasion curve, just to remind us that this is an active process of invasion that we need to think about. Where on the y-axis, we have area infested, and on the x-axis, we have time. These invasions happen over time, and so early on, we get an introduction, we'll have a very low population of the plant, maybe one or two plants present in one corner of your woodland or some area. And over time, as you see, it increases. Well, unfortunately, a lot of times we don't detect those populations until they're fairly widespread in our forests. And so this is one of the things our lab does, is try and promote early detection of these and a lot of monitoring. And the reason why that detection point is really important is as that population builds, it becomes a lot more expensive to actually control those populations. So if we can detect those populations a lot earlier, it's a lot easier for us to control them. It costs less. We don't have to do revegetation and active restoration to a certain degree. And these impacts that I just talked about can be minimized, if not eliminated, in many cases too. And so this concept is really important. Unfortunately, probably a lot of you are in this area where you have widespread populations, but if you are down here, good news, and we would recommend being really proactive. And I'll put it to you in an image. Which plant population, or which picture, these are two pictures of Japanese barberry, would you rather manage? The one on the left is a new infestation where we just see 2 or 3 shrubs. Those could easily be managed with a spot herbicide application, manual removal, or a combination of that. Whereas, as I'll show you pictures later on, this population takes extensive management. There's lots of negative impacts of that management, and it takes much longer to see that positive result. Okay, I want to just briefly cover some common invasive woody plants you should know. Some of these are probably all too familiar. These are ones we know are impactful. If you have them in your woods, manage them. Don't wait for them to get widespread. And I'll talk about a more extensive list. So first off, we want to talk about our bush honeysuckles. This is a range of species in the Lonicera genus. We do have a few natives, but not very, very many. They're dense, multi-stemmed shrubs. They can get quite tall, 6 to 12 feet in height. They have opposite leaves, very fragrant and showy flowers in the spring, and they're very, very widespread. Unfortunately, now these pictures are not what you see. What you see are this really shaggy bark that's kind of clear, that's kind of a lighter color. And if you look at twigs or cut those twigs, you'll see the pith is hollow. Those are really, really 2 key identifying characteristics of this plant. We have lots of different species. They all hybridize, so you can have different flower colors, and we have lots of information on these. But this is clearly one bad population. One that's equally as bad and equally as widespread are the 2 buckthorn species, common buckthorn and glossy buckthorn. These are very distinct barks, and there's a lot of other key characteristics in the wintertime. Looking at the buds, we have some fact sheets on that. And the leaves are rather distinct as well. These are really common in many of our forest systems as well. One that you may not be as aware of is really common in the South, but is getting more and more common and spreading, is autumn olive. This is one of these that we purposely planted thinking it was good for wildlife, and have since learned it's not so good. When actively growing in leaves, a key distinction is to look at the green on the upper side of the leaf and the white on the underside of the leaf, and the fruit and flowers are quite distinct as well. This one's clonal, and so it's really tough to control. So if we can keep it out, that's our ultimate goal. And then we have Japanese barberry, which we also already talked about. This is one that's really rapidly spreading in many of our forests. We have some large populations in the South and in the dells, but it's showing up in almost every forest I walk around in. We'll see one or two small plants. And yes, this is that plant that may be in your front yard of your house or at a gas station or in a strip mall somewhere. It is spreading into many of our forests, and we have that association with ticks. So be on the lookout. The good news is it's easy to manage, but it can't get widespread. So be actively looking for this plant to eradicate it, or at least keep it from getting widely established. So that was just a short list. We have a regional group that we've looked in the Great Lakes in general of what the regionally important woody invasive plants are. And here's a list of those, around 28 species. I've kind of looked at it and made some edits based on what I think are common woodies in Wisconsin, and we have around 15. And so I'd encourage you to be familiar with the resources or be looking for these 15 species. They're definitely causing impacts to our forests, and we want to actively manage them. And I'll show you some resources on how to learn how to identify these. We have resources on our website. So if you go to this website URL and click on resources, we've got invasive plant management fact sheets. We've got invasive plant identification videos of some, but not all of these. And if you go over to this invasive ID, we've got links to other fact sheets and other ones for all of these species as well. We also have been part of this collaborative group called WIGGLE, Woody Invasives of the Great Lakes. And this website, woodyinvasive.org, is a great resource where they have these 28 species. If you click on one species, like I click on amber cork tree, you can see they have a description of these along with lookalikes. If you scroll down, they've got really good images, examples of good fact sheets, and even if there's videos present, all there for you to look at. And there's control information in there as well. So great resource for you to look at various options. Okay, so that's just a general introduction about impacts. So if these are so impactful, like I'm suggesting, how should we manage these? Well, there's a range of management techniques that you can select, and we're going to go in detail on Thursday on the options. I like to always say there's pluses and minuses of every management option, so you really need to consider lots of details, and we don't want to always go with one by default. We often do use herbicides because woody species are very difficult to manage, but we've done research with non-chemical methods. We're doing work with goats right now, so I'd be happy to talk about that. Flaming techniques, hand removal, so those are all on the board. It's fitting the best tool or combinations of tool to your property and what your interests are in using as well. Again, this will be covered in detail on Thursday. What I will say, though, is the details of the site are really critical to know to dictate management. I give a lot of recommendations. I've got buckthorn on my property. What do? I say, well, how much buckthorn do you have? What other invasive plants do you have? What desirable plants do you have? What are the goals of your land? The goals, if you're trying to use it to forage for mushrooms, or if you're trying to use it for wildlife habitats, could widely differ in what tools you may utilize. So we need to know this stuff up front. We need to know a lot of the site-specific conditions. Is it near water? What's the water table? In order to give a really detailed recommendation. And unfortunately, the biggest issue that we run into is how much money do you have available to work with this? Because if it's a situation like this in the top screen where you just got a couple here and there, money's really not an object. It's relatively inexpensive to control and remove. We don't need revegetation. But if you have a wall or thicket like you see here, it's going to be really expensive to manage it. So you really need to think about how do I manage this so it's feasible, and do I have the resources to undertake it? And in some cases, the answer may be no, unfortunately. And really what you need to do is develop a plan. And this is what I love talking to woodland and forestry owners, because this is probably what they've been talking to you about for years, is developing a forestry management plan. Well, we need to incorporate invasive plant management planning into that as well. That in this plan has 5 approaches. First, we need to identify the plant species because management is species specific, and I'll give you some resources in a second to show that. We then need to figure out how much of it do we have on our property. Is it all covered? Is it just in one corner? Is it widespread? What's the density? And so having some sort of a map, it can be a high-tech map, and it can be a simple map drawn on a piece of paper too, but that really helps. Then you need to go out and research and find out what the effective control options are and how to do those, how to conduct those options. And then you need to actively do that control and then observe what worked and what didn't and adapt your management over time. And just in general, my experience is that usually it's pretty easy for us to identify. We have the capabilities to come up with a map, whether it's high tech or low tech. Easy to conduct the research. Usually where the biggest mishap happens in the control. And so I get a lot of phone calls from people saying, Mark, man, I did exactly what you told me and it didn't work. And I go, oh, well, that's interesting. So then I have a conversation. I say, well, what did you exactly do? Well, you know, I did exactly what you want. I used this herbicide and I applied it at this rate. And I said, when did you apply it? And they say, well, I didn't have time to do it when you told me to, so I did it at this time. And it didn't work. Timing is really, really critical with many of these approaches. So you really got to follow those those control recommendations like you would a cooking recipe. And that's most often the reason for the failure is they miss the timing or they mix at the wrong rate or something like that. So what are some resources for woody shrub identification? I think the 2 biggest ones, again, I would point to would be this WIGGLE, this woodyinvasives.org. And then my website also has some really good resources as well. If you're really a botanist, you really like geeking out in the technical terms, probably Minnesota Wildflower website is a great resource. They have really good images as well. So I use that intensively. Our Wisp Flora has a lot of good resources, but I find this Minnesota Wildflower is really easy to navigate and has probably better pictures than our Wisp Flora stuff. So those are 2 good resources. If you go to our website, we've got detailed fact sheets on a bunch of these and videos. The neat thing about these videos is it's me or one of my staff saying, here's garlic mustard. You need to look exactly at this feature, and this is how you differentiate it from other lookalikes. And so it can be really useful to play and rewind and look at it. And so we have lots of those for some of our key woody species and others. We also have detailed fact sheets that talk about these and include control and management information as well. So these are really good resources. I do want to also point out we do have this master data table under this invasive ID where we've collected all the information of regulated invasive plants in Wisconsin, terrestrial plants at least, and put them in this database. And we've linked all sorts of resources along with this, distribution maps, fact sheets, ours and others. And one of the neat things that we also have in there is we have tables with lookalikes. So if you're like, I think it's a species, but maybe it's not, these tables can be a really easy shortcut to verify if it's a native or non-native lookalike or not too. So I encourage you to look at that tab as well if you're looked at identification. Okay, moving right along, I want to just now kind of just in general talk about some consideration and tips and some information that'll help you when you're planning for management. Management can be really intensive, as you can see here. And so some tips can really help improve management. I just want to go over a few general ones. And the first tip I have is prevention. These woods, in our experience, and Bill and Tom and Tony can disagree with me if they like, but I would argue that all of our forests are vulnerable to invasive woody plants invasions. So we need to actively be monitoring when we see these moving into an area or on the edge, we need to proactively control them. And I would argue that it's really easy to do this. It's inexpensive. We have lots of tools that are effective. We don't need to revegetate or restore. And so there's lots of reasons to really do this. And if we look at our grasslands as examples, these woody plants can start causing impacts at very, very low levels when the cover is around 2% or so. Is what the research. So we don't know what that is in forests, but I'm sure it's a lower number versus a higher number. And so being proactive is probably our first line of defense and doing lots of monitoring. And I'll point out that we can and we have gone in and controlled these dense infestations. And I like showing this picture because this is an example of this dense Japanese barberry infestation. It's right by Taliesin. It's on their property. So we went in this population and we went and controlled it. We sprayed it with some herbicides. We got like 95% control or so. But if you look closely, the year after we sprayed it, there's really not a lot of plants at all in the understory. And we still have a few that are resprouting, as you see there. And the plants that have survived are not really of high quality and highly desirable plants. So we're controlling it when we can control them, but it costs a lot of money. And then we have a lot of negative impacts from those control techniques, which is unfortunate. So if you have these areas like this that have been infested for decades, like this one is an example that we know has been infested for over 30 years, plan on a long battle with many interventions. Don't expect or assume that you can go in, control it, and it'll return to normal at once too. And this is where planning comes into play. Maybe if you have an area that's been infested for a long time, you don't start there. You start at the edges of the populations where they're small because you have some desirable plants growing and intermixed, and then you work your way into the dense areas. Because what happens is there's a lot of negative feedback loops that happens with these infestations. As you see here, we have all this bush honeysuckle. The only native plant that we have underneath there is garlic mustard. And then even if I took the picture in summer, which I'll show you a picture, I believe, later, you don't see any desirable plants at all there because of this negative feedback loop. So we would need to introduce native plants in order to gain success. So start on the edges, work your way into these at the last time, because these are very, very intensive to manage. And I think one of the big lessons, and I'm sure we'll talk a ton about it on Thursday, is realize looking at how old the invasive shrub or tree you're trying to control is and how many of you have, because that can really determine your level of success and then the amount of resources you use. And I give two examples here. On the left, this is a bush honeysuckle that's, we don't know how old, probably 50 plus years. We know it's been mowed several times, and we've sprayed this plant twice with herbicides. And you can see we've done tremendous damage and killed some of the surrounding ones, but this one's still responding and regrowing because it's incredibly old. It's got lots of resources that's resisting control. But we just had a few of these in there too. So while we're spending a lot of time on these, there's just a few of them. In contrast, here's some example control areas of common buckthorn. This is in a pine forest, and the majority of these buckthorn plants are around the diameter of a pencil, very thin, but a gazillion of them. So in this case, as you can see, these ones flagged were all sprayed with a herbicide. We had really high levels of success with really dilute concentrations of herbicide. It was really easy to kill them because they're small and they don't have a lot of resources. But we spent a tremendous amount of time and herbicide because there's so many of them to spray. And so we need to keep those in mind when we're selecting the management approach. And this is where really the art of management comes into play. And we will talk a lot about herbicides. They're a great tool for management. We can get really high levels of control from just one application, 90+%, if not 100%. If we want to do some other type of activity like mowing or revegetation. Often we can integrate it pretty easily, goats with them. And it usually tends to be very cost effective, as I'll show you some data too. So lots of pluses for using herbicides. But if you are going to use herbicides, we strongly encourage getting training on the proper use of them. We have a pesticide applicator training program here at the university that's excellent and has great resources. And there's a whole slew of other training opportunities available. And there's many reasons for training. One of them is if we misapply, these applications can cause dramatic damage to desirable plants. Many of these herbicides we use are taken up by the foliage, the leaves and stems, but also some of them are can persist in the soil for an amount of time and be taken up in the soil. And so here's a great example of one of the few last native relics of oaks in Racine County. There were some invasive plants that were growing at the base of here, and they decided that they wanted to control those. And they used a soil residual herbicide, Arsenal, which is Invasive, did a great job controlling the knotweed, but also was then taken up by many of the oak trees from the soil. And we're having death and high levels of injury of those few oak trees too in this one native area on the bluffs, which is really, truly unfortunate. We have to be concerned about movement of these pesticides off-site and contaminating waters as well. And obviously there are some human health concerns. And so our recommendation, if you're going to use them, get some training on the proper use and how to use the proper personal protective equipment and follow the directions. I would say 99, if not 99 to 99.9% of these impacts can be mitigated, if not eliminated, if directions are followed appropriately. So, you may be getting optimistic and saying, oh, this is great. We've got all these tools. We talked a lot about herbicides. We'll talk a lot about this hack and squirt on Thursday because a lot of people don't use it, but it's really effective for large plants. Got surface applications. We even are getting some success from some directed flame approaches, and we can talk about goats. We've got some active research going on with them and have some data to share too. But if we've got all these great tools, then why aren't we doing more management? These all cost money, and lots of it with our dense infestations that we have in many of our woods. Hopefully your woods aren't like that, but that's the case. So one of the things that we've been doing to kind of educate people is what the costs of these various techniques are. Through some of our research, we've been trying to estimate the costs, and I can explain to you how we do it if you're interested, but I thought I'd just share with you some of these cost estimates just to put things in perspective. Before I do so, I do want to mention that when COVID struck, we were doing a lot of these demonstrations for field days on how to control some of these invasive plants, particularly bush honeysuckle and buckthorn, and we've got a large experiment with Japanese barberry. And so what we did with these two is we created these virtual field tours, which you can visit from my website. If you go down to research, click on research, woody invasive plant management demos, and here are pictures with different treatments that we applied and summarizing what worked and what didn't work and what some of the impacts are as well. And we have lots of pictures too. So I encourage you to look at some of these demos to better understand what these are and some of the scenarios that, because these are a lot of them where we're estimating the cost. But let me I have lots of slides on the details on the cost, but I'm just going to generally give you the overall summary. First off, it's really dependent upon how many plants you have. So when we're doing Japanese barberry research, we had anywhere from 5 to 10 plants per 100 square feet. Our management costs range between $100 and a little under $1,000 per acre. When we did buckthorn, these were really small, skinny buckthorns, but we had 14 to 40 plants per 100 square feet, so a lot more, three to four times more. Our management costs were a lot more. 2,000 to 7,000. And yes, this includes herbicide and time for us to do that work. And then with bush honeysuckle, in this example, we had a low population density, only 5 plants per square foot. But these bush honeysuckle plants were massive. They were like small VW bugs in size, 8 feet tall, 15 feet long, massive plants. And so in that case, our costs were between $2,000 and $13,000 per acre. And again, that's just for one effective round of management. Now, looking at the individual treatments and their costs, it also varies by method. By far the cheapest one consistently was the foliar application, where we're doing a dilute concentration of a herbicide. It's usually less than 2 or 1%, depending on the herbicide. So it's very cost effective. Our basal bark applications tended to be also very cheap, but a little bit more expensive. Why they're so cheap? With this technique, you're spraying the lower foot of the plant, but you're not cutting it. But you are using a much more concentrated herbicide solution, a 10 to 30% solution. We'll talk more about this on Thursday. This stem injection or hack and squirt can also be really effective, particularly for larger species, but it's going to cost, close to $1 a plant. In that case, you're using an even more concentrated solution and you're just hacking it into the stem. Again, we'll talk about it later. Cut surface is also effective. Why this one can be a lot more expensive is you actually have to take time to cut the stem and then remove the actual stem and pile it and do something with it. So that takes time. And so particularly with our larger plants, it's in the multiple dollars per range. If it's really small plants, you can do it much more effectively. Well, what about some of the non-chemical approaches? We estimated direct flaming was around 15 cents per shrub. We didn't get a lot of success with this, so but others have seen better success than we did. We can certainly talk about it on Thursday. Forestry mowing, where we're actually hiring someone to come in and mechanically remove the vegetation with a forestry mower. We've had that done on several of our properties, and we estimate it's around $600 per acre to hire someone, a contractor, to do that. That's based on, I believe, 3 projects. So obviously there's a wide range depending on where you are. And then management would need to be done on the resprouting plants after that forestry mowing. And goat grazing is something that has a lot of interest. We're currently doing some work with goat grazing. We're working with one contractor, and based on those costs, which we've talked to others, we feel is pretty representative. In our relatively dense infestations, where we're grazing twice in a season, it's anywhere from $900 to $1,500 an acre. And you may be surprised, why is that so expensive? Well, when you're using goats, you need to actually create an electric fence, not only so they don't escape, but also it protects them from the predators. And that takes a lot of time and resources to do that too. So it's not a cheap endeavor to work with goats, although there are some distinct benefits to them too. So we can see that it can be quite costly. And so that's why the emphasis is on trying to get these before these populations get very dense. The good news is if you're not counting your money, or you can get volunteers to do it, 80 to 90% of these costs are all time for you to conduct the management. So if you can get well-trained people to do it at a reduced or for free, these costs are much, much less. Okay, so to kind of sum things up, and this is great because I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions, and I've done so. Manage invasive plants to meet your land management goals is my best advice. If you have new invasive plants that aren't impacting now, learn how to identify those and get rid of them before they get widespread. But develop a plan, particularly for those widespread ones, and ask for help. We're here to help, as well as I'm sure others are. Tony and Bill The key is that we get you the right information so you can develop an effective plan. Realize that plan's going to take years, not a year, to implement. And there's lots of great resource and information out there. There is some bad information and some information that's maybe not well documented. So we always utilize that you're using experts in science-based publications. And there's lots of people out there in the forestry world that can help you. You just need to ask for help too. I want to give you my website again, and my email is here. And with that, I want to thank you for the time. And it looks like I got 15 minutes left. And so I'm going to stop sharing the screen and see if there's some questions that Bill or Tony, you want to read to me that I can try and answer.
There's one, Mark, there's one directly related to that, the cost, the second to last slide you shown about costs. And you kind of answered it by saying that it's 90% less the cost of your numbers if you do it yourself. So the cost of the materials, the cost is like 10% of what you've been showing there. Is like if someone just wanted to do the work themselves and they're not going to pay themselves, it's just the cost of the herbicide, the cost of renting the equipment. Is that a fair assessment? Am I reading that right?
Yeah, so I'll go into a little bit more detail about how we calculated that. What we did is we basically just we didn't account for renting the equipment. So the cost of the equipment, unless is not included in that, it's basically the materials is the propane we used or the herbicide we used. And then what we did is recorded how long it took us to put out those management treatments per unit area. And we used, I believe, there's a going rate for that's a federal hourly rate. I think it's like 28 bucks an hour for people that do conservation work. And so that's how we calculated it. And so if you take that out, essentially it's like 85 to 90% of that cost is labor. Obviously, there's a little bit of variability depending on the treatment, and I have more data if people are interested that we can really flesh out what those costs are, and it's in those fact sheets and those virtual field tours. The exceptions are we don't have a forestry mower, so we're just estimating the cost that to rent an expert come out and do those forestry mowing. And the goats, we don't have our goats, and so we're estimating the cost per unit area to rent goats on those properties.
And if you hired a contractor to do that work, are you going to be paying similar kind of rate as to what you came up with in your trials?
Yeah, and so those are based on the contractor rates, Bill.
Okay.
So I can be clear. So what we've learned is so I'll give you a really good example is we're doing a lot of work with goats, and we've been talking about with other researchers in other states about how much it costs to rent a goat. And there's this common accepted rate, but then you go to the UP and it's twice as much, and then you go to other areas and it's half. So there's a lot of variability in those costs. So I think what I would encourage people to think of is that's a launching off point. If you're looking at renting a forestry mower, you can certainly have a starting point, but it's going to be very regionally dependent.
And you recommended folks attend an herbicide applicator training, or I always assume those were just for professionals, but those are open to anybody, huh?
Those are open to anybody, and there's also really good. They also have some really good books that you could just purchase. You don't need to get a license, but it's just good to get some additional training. And so you could go through the pesticide applicator training. They have some online courses as well. I'm not sure if they have one on forestry, but they have one on rights of way and natural areas, which really just covers herbicides. They just came out with a new book. It's really good. So just getting some training and some introduction to that is what I would recommend. Because there's a lot of if you don't have any training, there's a lot of mistakes that can be really dramatic and cause some widespread impacts.
Early on, you mentioned that there's things that impact how you manage the invasives on your property. You said how much are you willing to spend. You said the goals that the landowner has an impact on the management. Could you talk a little bit about how someone's goals would impact how the management of the invasive species that are going to take place? Maybe some
Yeah, I
examples of.
mean, yeah, and so that's a challenge, but I know like a lot of times um, we work with groups and organizations, nonprofits, that their goal is diversity, right? So they want as many different plants there, native plants there as possible. And so with that, we're really trying to develop a structure of that forest that maximizes diversity. Um, Someone else may be really interested in regeneration. We want to make sure that we get some good oak regeneration. We might select a different management strategy that really promotes that. A lot of people are interested in, say in wildlife or deer hunting. With that, we may want to have less openness and more cover for the deer. And so there's really a wide range. So we really just ask them to give us more information on what that is. And in some extreme cases, while some of these are heavily impactful, sometimes there's situations where, depending on what their goals are, it might not be worth them to spend thousands of dollars to manage their invasives, because their invasives might not be impacting their goals, right? So that's not a real specific example, but that's kind of what my thought is. I'm a big proponent of, you have goals, have those goals drive your management. Yeah, so that would be my response.
Okay, we got a question in. Can you see the
Yeah.
question? Go ahead.
I got a question directly to me from Chris, and so I'm just going to read this and then comment. He or she says, historically had great success with forestry mowing. Woodlot is in MFL. Current forester is absolutely con forestry mowing due to potential impacts on desirable species in the mowed off understory. Comments. Yeah, I mean, I think that, being an MFL, there are some restrictions on the tools and techniques you can use. I think depending on the species, forestry mowing can be great. And if it's really dense, it can be a great way to open the canopy. And it does kill some of those invasive woody shrubs and other non-desirables. We don't really have good data on the percentage that the forestry mowing itself kills. So we're actually trying to do some research to figure that out. But if I had to take a wild ass guess, I'd say anywhere from 20 to 40% of the shrubs that are mowed don't resprout. So it's really positive, but there are some negative impacts. One of the negative impacts are, if you have native woody species, usually those are mowed along with the non-native ones and you might be impacting some of the regen potential if you have some regeneration. If you're forestry mowing in the summer when the ground isn't frozen, you can be doing pretty impactful to the understory species and increasing erosion. In the South here, we try to do all our forestry mowing in the winter time when the grounds are frozen and we don't have a lot of desirable species around. And that tends to work really well, but obviously if you have feet of snow on the ground, that's not a viable option. So I guess my comment, Chris, would be, ask your forester why they don't like the forestry mowing. What is it they're concerned about? And try and really pinpoint that to better have that conversation. And I don't know, I'd maybe turn it over to Bill and Tony. Do you guys have some comments on forestry mowing and the potential negative aspects?
I think the diversity and taking out native regeneration, native seedlings coming in is the biggest thing. And I think with MFL especially, that really limits options, because it's based in law on what you're supposed to do and how much you're supposed to have, supposed to promote regeneration. If you're not an MFL, I guess it's a whole different kind of situation.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, I would also just add that it probably greatly, the results vary by operator too. Who's running the machinery. Those can be pretty heavy hammers sometimes, but That's all I'd add.
Yeah, Tony, that's a really good point. And that the type of, we say forestry mower, but you know, there's definitely, and I'm not an equipment guy, but some of them are really seem to be better. And sometimes people call a forestry mower taking a bush hog into the forest. And you definitely see differences in effectiveness with those as well too. So that's a good point. I would strongly recommend getting someone who's experienced. And just to give a cost, we usually see they usually do like an hourly rate of $100 to $150 an hour. That's kind of the range that we've seen. I don't know, Tony and Bill, if that's kind of what you've heard.
I
Yeah,
haven't
that's about what I've heard, and it's remarkable what a skilled operator can get done in that amount of time in a day or a half day. When you
Agreed.
consider how long it takes to treat in other ways.
Yeah.
There's another question in the chat, Mark.
Oh,
Would
yeah.
one-
Okay.
Go ahead. Oh, will one foliar or basal bark application be effective to control buckthorn, either small diameter buckthorn? I've heard that it takes an additional application the following year.
So I would encourage you to look at that virtual field tour, because we have one of the plots is exactly that, small buckthorn that's like small diameter. And I'm going to state from memory, but go look, we have the data there. I want to say with the right herbicide application, we got 100% control. So one application on small plants applied at the right timing and stage is really highly successful with buckthorn. Now, one of the tricks that they'll talk about Thursday, but I'll just mention, Maya, is sometimes people make the mistake and they try to apply when the so first, to do the basal bark treatment, in particular, you need to mix it with bark oil or kerosene. I recommend always using the bark oil. And you want to make sure and make that application with the basal bark when the actual stem is dry. If the stem is wet, sometimes it creates an impenetrable layer that the herbicide can't get through. So if you follow the directions, basal bark should work really well, and foliar as well. The key with foliar applications that really limits control, in my experience, it's size. So we're talking about small ones, so that's a non-issue. And we want to make sure that plant is actively growing. So we had lots of areas that were under drought stress. If that plant is drought stressed and not actively growing, then you can get some reduced success. But easily 90+% control. I'd say 95 to 99 if you're doing it, following the directions and the recommendations with small buckthorn.
That graphic you showed of the cost to control based on the monitoring and detection was really, really powerful. And I wonder if you had some thoughts on guidelines for people as to the frequency they should monitor, what time of year they should monitor to make sure they get the detection as early as possible. And if there's a methodology to follow to get the best, most extensive monitoring you can on the property.
Yeah, I mean, that's really a challenge because the different species have different cues that make them easy to distinguish. I would say if we're going to make a generalization, early spring or probably late fall are the best, particularly for the buckthorns and the honeysuckles, because they're the first to leaf out and the last to lose their leaves. And so that's a really good time to look for those. But there's other species that you may want to walk. So what I would emphasize first is walk your property and just note where those are. If you can do it at a minimum once a year, if you can do it multiple times a year, great. And just create some type of map. And we have like GPS, and there's resources on how to do it through a smartphone. But you can simply do it on a piece of paper and just mark that, and then keep updating that is really a key. And you don't need to be super detailed. If there's a ton of it, you can just say this whole area is covered, but the key is you want to find when a new species is coming in, particularly Japanese barberry, because then you can just take it out. The bad news is that most of these infestations are coming in by birds eating the berries and then flying into your property. So another trick for monitoring that I'd recommend is monitor the perimeter, go more often than the interior. And anytime you do any type of disturbance, you should go back 6 months to a year and just take a quick peek and look for it too. Those are my tips of the trade. I realize some of the times the land is too big and too hard to walk through, but the more times you can monitor, the better. We have some resources that can help and some GPS tools that we can talk about in the future, but we don't need to make it complicated. The key is that you just monitor it to some degree.
I see we got a question in from Keith, but we're just about out of time. I want to thank Mark for your time, and I'll be sharing his contact information and all the links that he talked about in an email later today, along with a link to the recording if you want to watch it again. Thanks a lot, Mark, for your time. I appreciate it, and a great conversation about invasive species. Any last word before we sign off?
No, yeah, I'll just say burning can be really it's
Oh.
another tool to use in the toolbox.
And thanks. Okay. Thanks, everyone. And if you haven't signed up for the Thursday session yet, you still can. It's not too late. And thanks, Mark, for your presentation. And everybody have a great day.
Okay, thanks. Take care.